Could Brexit be reaching its endgame? Boris Johnson came back with a deal from Brussels yesterday which he claims has got rid of the backstop and so genuinely takes back control. The deal will be put to the Commons at a special parliamentary session tomorrow, and by all accounts the vote will be incredibly tight. What's in the deal? What happens if it passes? And what next if it falls? On this Friday night edition of Tisky Sour, I'm joined by Dawn Foster, staff writer at Jacobin. Welcome to the show. I'm also joined by Tom Kibasi, director at the IPPR, who I assume is speaking in a personal capacity this evening.
Purely personal capacity.
Purely personal capacity. I want to start with you, Tom. An introduction to what's in this deal that's different to Theresa May's deal.
Okay, so I think this is quite a substantially different deal for a whole series of reasons. The first one is that it takes the protections for workers' rights and environmental protections and consumer standards out of the legal text of the withdrawal agreement and lands them in the political declaration, which is basically a statement of intent, so it doesn't have any legal force. So what that means is it opens the door to a decade of deregulation where you'd be able to cut back on those rights and standards and protections in order to cut a trade deal with, say, Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So that's the first big thing. The second big thing is on Northern Ireland, where it effectively abolishes the backstop by implementing all of its provisions on a permanent basis. So it effectively creates a one country, two systems model for the UK, where Northern Ireland will be effectively in the single market and in the European Union customs union. As a result, as soon as the UK diverges on any regulations from the rest of the EU, there'll need to be regulatory checks in the Irish Sea. And whilst for people who want unification, that's obviously a good thing, it's a big step forward towards the reunification of Ireland. For the Unionists, they have a lot of problems with that, and that's why the DUP aren't able to support it. It clearly moves away from having a customs union. So whereas previously the political declaration said that it would build on the withdrawal agreement and effectively was pointing towards high regulatory alignment and a customs union, what this deal does is basically put that option to bed and say it's heading explicitly towards a free trade agreement. What that means is a huge set of problems for British industry. So you saw in the week beforehand that the car makers, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, food and beverage manufacturing, all these industries said this is going to be a disaster for British industry. So as a whole, it changes the scenario. And if you look at the government's own assessments of the impact of different deals, this is a much, much worse deal for the British economy than even May's deal. So May's deal was bad. That was going to make us poorer. This will make every household more than £2,000 a year less well off in the future. So this is a very bad deal for Britain. And that's the big difference. It's worse than Theresa May's deal. And of course, it satisfies one particular group, which is those that want to reorientate the UK from the European sphere to the American sphere, cut a deal with Donald Trump and deregulate to be able to do that. And that's what its objective is. And that's why I think it should be opposed.
So the main difference there, I suppose, is that this deal is for a harder Brexit than the one that Theresa May was offering. That was a softer Brexit. In terms of what Boris Johnson has negotiated, one victory he can probably claim is that there is now an exit mechanism from the backstop, which isn't unilaterally held with the European Union. To me, that looked like, I don't want a harder Brexit, so I'd happily have all of the UK in a customs union. But if you were a hard Brexiteer, the fact that it's decided in Northern Ireland whether or not they stay in the regulatory orbit of the European Union or with the rest of Britain or with the rest of the United Kingdom, that seems like he got a concession there.
Well, he got a concession of sorts. So you get a vote every 4 years and a 2-year cooling off period. Of course, were Northern Ireland to then vote in that particular direction, it would then require a hard border to be established on the island of Ireland. So it's one of those things where, to some extent, there is a unilateral exit mechanism, but the unilateral exit mechanism is to restart the Troubles by erecting a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Dawn, I have been struggling over the last 24 hours, I suppose, to work out exactly what is going to happen in Northern Ireland. It seems quite confusing. They're going to be de jure within the customs union. So when Britain signs trade deals, it's also going to apply to Northern Ireland. But they're going to be de facto within the European Union's customs union, as it were. what the hell is that going to look like in practice? How do you be in law within? How do you be in law outside of the customs union, but de facto inside of it?
So it becomes incredibly complicated. So a lot of the details, especially around VAT, are still not quite there. There's a lot of talk about whether or not certain goods would not have any tariffs applied to, would not have any checks applied to them. So, for instance, if you were moving from London to Belfast, everything that you moved, as you were moving house, wouldn't be subject to various checks, wouldn't be subject to tariffs, etc. But there's also talk of moving in a kind of rebate scheme. So essentially, kind of pay now, claim back later. And a lot of people are very, very unhappy about that. And there are still a huge number of issues that aren't fully fleshed out, and a lot of people in Northern Ireland are still very unhappy and very unclear about what it means, because it's a very, very dense document. There's a lot of discussion about how exactly you would exit the new kind of so instead of a backstop, it's the permanent status quo. And there's a lot of discussion about how you would actually exit that. Stormont isn't sitting at the moment. They're going back in for a very, very peculiar, complex optics sit-in where with some of the parties on Monday that means literally nothing. But at the moment, if Northern Ireland wanted to actually exit the new backstop, which is now the status quo, it's a full stop, they would have to, they would have to move to a vote. Every 4 years that would kick in, and there's still a lot of to and fro-in over whether or not there would be a community element to it, whether or not you would have to get buy-in from both communities. But also, a lot of people are pointing out there are a huge number of people in Northern Ireland who aren't a member of either community. It's actually a very complex place, a lot more complex than a lot of people would like to claim it is. And then what do you do if Stormont isn't sitting? At the moment, it seems that if Stormont isn't sitting, then it just rolls over every 2 years until it does eventually sit again. But there is a huge amount of detail that hasn't been fully fleshed out. And I think it's really interesting that it seemed very obvious that the Conservatives thought that they could bounce the DUP into agreeing to a deal by jumping out on Wednesday. I've been awake for years now, and saying we have a deal. The DUP are on side, and the DUP said nothing's changed. We gave you a statement at 7 a.m. Nothing's changed. We are not on side. And Sammy Wilson, their Brexit spokesman, has been travelling around every single kind of media outlet that will have him, and pointing out that they will be voting against it, not abstaining. They will be voting heavily against it, but also claiming that they have hard Brexiters coming to them and saying that they will be back in the DUP and that they will take the DUP's lead. So the DUP are very, very heavily against it because they don't want to be seen any differently to Britain. They see themselves as British, and they see this as a complete capitulation by Boris Johnson. They think he's thrown them under the bus entirely, and apparently, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives haven't made any effort to contact anybody in the DUP since the deal was announced.
And presumably they can see what everyone else can. So I suppose the reason, in my mind, the EU moved away from the backstop, which was the idea that if you have not sorted out a trading relationship that keeps a soft border, the whole island of Ireland will stay in the customs union. Now, that holds. That's the case unless Stormont decides otherwise. But presumably what everyone is assuming is that Stormont will never decide that. And the DUP can presumably see that Northern Ireland will never vote for a hard border on the island of Ireland.
Yes, absolutely. So the DUP don't think that will happen, but also they are completely opposed to ever being treated differently to what they see as the rest of the UK. They're very, very upset about it. They're very, very angry about it. But also some of their reasoning seems incredibly peculiar. So Sammy Wilson was on Radio 4 Today programme this morning. I expected him just to say Boris Johnson has sold us, has thrown us under the bus. He's sold us down the river. And actually, Sammy Wilson said that the DUP would be voting against the deal, and he thought that if the deal fell, that then we'd move to a general election, and then Boris Johnson would jump out and get a much harder deal, and even though he wouldn't need the DUP, he'd bring them back on side. So it seems this really peculiar, really, really peculiar thing where I'm convinced that Sammy Wilson is exactly the kind of person who genuinely believes that that his dog isn't dead, it's alive on a farm and it will come back someday. He is convinced that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives still need the DUP, still care about them, and ever cared about them at all, other than just to make a little margin up in the Commons.
You've been arguing that the Northern Ireland situation in the New Deal is unsustainable. I can see why the DUP don't like it, because it gives Northern Ireland a different status to Great Britain or the rest of the United Kingdom. But why is it unsustainable? Why can't that just plod along and, yes, some people in the DUP can be angry about it?
So I think there are two reasons. So one is to pick up on what Dawn said about the complexity of this new system and whether it can be understood. Given it hasn't yet been worked out, and it's supposed to be really complex, and it involves really complex rebates and all of that kind of stuff, why would any business invest in Northern Ireland? I can't see any rationale of why a business would choose to invest in Northern Ireland under those circumstances, because they simply don't know how a system's going to operate. And then even if it was known how that system would operate, it would be really costly to operate it. So if you have to claim back the tariffs as rebates, it basically means any business operating in Northern Ireland that is a importer and exporter, so does, for instance, different types of assembly and manufacturing. So in the UK, manufacturing about 35% or 40% of manufactured goods in the UK are made with components that are imported. Then you're going to have an incredibly complex system that's going to mean that you have to have much more working capital in the business. So it's going to be a long run, less competitive place to invest. So I think that's the first problem, because at the end of the day, prosperity is always essential for peace. It's one of the real foundation stones of peace. I think the other reason that it's unsustainable is that whilst it will give Northern Ireland the ability to say it doesn't consent to such an arrangement in theory every 4 years, it doesn't mean that those people who live there have their views represented in the European processes. So they won't have an MEP, they won't be able to input to the Commission, they will be in this kind of strange special status where they effectively have regulation without representation. And I think in the long run, this will be seen as an important step towards reunification. The other thing that I suppose I think it reveals, and I'd be really interested to know what Dawn thinks about this, is to some extent it suggests to me that the Good Friday Agreement was always more of a model of shared sovereignty than people had necessarily appreciated, and that actually the nationalists had secured a much more comprehensive success in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement than perhaps people realised at the time. And in a sense, I don't think at the time people thought the Good Friday Agreement was a form of shared sovereignty. I think what this process had revealed is that it was shared sovereignty mediated through the EU. And I think that's why we've had so many problems. But I wonder, Dawn knows a lot more about this than I do. I wonder whether that is a sort of reasonable thing to say.
No, I think it's completely right. And I think it's been really, really interesting talking to nationalists about what they think about this. And they've all been very, very strategic and very, very thoughtful and said, look, it's a massive document. We need to think a lot about this. But it addresses a lot of our concerns and it addresses a lot of our worries. And, obviously the DUP are hugely upset, and that's always, encouraging. It's really interesting to see the DUP, who campaigned very, very hard against the Good Friday Agreement, suddenly talking about, all of the principles of the Good Friday Agreement just being completely thrown asunder after multiple promises by the Conservatives. And I think most people that I speak to now in Northern Ireland and the Republic just fully, even before this Brexit deal, they felt that, unification was inevitable. But now, after this, they genuinely think it's going to be within the next 5 years. And I think what's really interesting is that when, obviously, all the nationalists I know have always been in favour of it, and when they talk about Brexit, they see this as a massive catalyst. It's really, it's really kind of sharpened a lot of people's perceptions of how they are perceived by a lot of people in England, and especially in London, especially the Conservatives. But what's been really interesting is that throughout this whole process, the DUP and the Unionists have been really sharply focus on London, occasionally looking at Brussels, but at no point have the unionists look to the people that they need to win over if they want to keep the union together. So they've constantly focused on looking at the Conservatives, they've constantly focused on England, they've constantly focused on London. And obviously there's a big nationalist community in North Ireland, and they've always been in favour of unification. But there's a really, really big community of people who don't who fall into that hinterland, who don't traditionally describe themselves as nationalists, don't traditionally come from a unionist background, and the nationalists have done a lot of work to win them over. The English, and especially the Conservatives, have done a lot of work by just making them really angry, and so everybody's been kind of slowly working to push people towards unification, whereas unionists have done nothing.
I want to move beyond. I want to move on from the Northern Ireland question towards the level playing field question. Although I do wish that I'd put in. Did you see the question time video last night of the guy in the audience who was saying,
who invented?
He gave a really impassioned speech, which was basically saying, I think Boris Johnson's done all right. Actually, I think he's gone there and he's done a really good deal. And you've got Martin Daubney from the Brexit Party doing these big, theatrical nods on the stage, and Matt Hancock doing these theatrical nods, and then he says, and I don't know. I mean, this Northern Ireland thing. Why doesn't the island of Ireland just be one country? And then there's the.
He actually says, why doesn't it become an island?
Yeah. Why don't we just go back to that? I want to do level playing field stuff. So the Labour Party's main attack line against. You're right, Dawn.
No, I'm dying.
Oh, have some water. The main attack line from the Labour Party over this deal is that it is a ruse by the Conservative Party and by Boris Johnson to enable us to slash regulations when it comes to the environment and workers' rights. Before I ask you about it, I want to go to a clip, because Boris Johnson is obviously denying this, and he is doing a schmoozing operation to try and win round Labour leavers. How successful that will be, we'll talk about in the second half of the show. But first of all, this is Boris Johnson talking to Robert Peston about why his Brexit deal does not threaten workers' rights.
Can you enshrine in law the kind of guarantees they want on environmental protection and workers' rights, for example?
Well, it will be there in the political declaration, and I cannot.
What about in the withdrawal agreement bill, which is coming up?
The withdrawal agreement bill will almost certainly contain the kind of protections and provisions that you are talking about, but though we won't be publishing it immediately.
So he's saying, Boris Johnson there, speaking to Robert Peston, saying we don't need to worry about slashing workers' rights because, one, the political declaration says we won't be undercutting the EU, and two, in the withdrawal bill when it comes forward, because what they're voting on tomorrow is just a motion to say they back the deal in principle, that will contain guarantees about workers' rights. How worried should we be that this is a slash and burn project?
Well, I think it's really rather ridiculous to say that you shouldn't be worried about it if you take out the legal protection that says there'll be no undercutting of workers' rights that's in the original draft withdrawal agreement, and then you put it into a non-binding waffle agreement about what you might do in the future, but hey, who knows? Why else would you do it? So if it's really the case that there's no intention to undercut workers' rights, then why remove all the provisions that protect workers' rights from the legal text? I mean, I think there is just something really big here. It's 2019, and if you were to wind the clock back to 1979, 40 years ago, and you'd say to yourself, what is happening now with Thatcher? And you saw that assault on workers throughout the 1980s. And I think in a way this is setting the stage up for another assault on workers in the 2020s. And I can't see why you would believe that a hard right Conservative government that believes in deregulation, that wants a trade deal with Trump, that removes the legal protections contained in the withdrawal agreement, would somehow not have an agenda for cutting back workers' rights. Like, that's what they believe in. That's what they do as a kind of matter of course. It's the core of their ideology, is deregulate. And given that workers' rights have been eroded gradually over time anyway now, right? All the changes the Tories have brought in. So, for example, saying that you don't get many of the protections from being dismissed for the first 2 years. What they've done in terms of just allowing zero hours contracts to continue and all the other abuses that they've permitted, cutting back the enforcement of minimum wage regulations. Why on earth would anyone believe that someone who takes away the ability, takes away the protection from the legal text and moves it into the document that doesn't have legal force has any other intention? And I think there's something really big about the labour movement remembering and recalling the struggles of the 1980s and the solidarity that it took in that period to resist those kind of assaults on workers, because it wasn't just about shutting things down and closing the mines or whatever, right? It was things like in Wapping in 1986 when Murdoch summarily dismissed all the print workers and didn't give them redundancy payments, right? It was an attack on their rights as well as an attack on British industries. And you kind of look to the future and you say, well, there's no protection for workers' rights that they're putting in. There isn't a customs union, so we know that's going to damage British industry. And you put it together and you say, history is sort of repeating itself. And we stand on the precipice of the 2020s, just as they in 1979 stood on the precipice of the 1980s. And why on earth would we want to repeat that experience all over again? And I think in the 80s, the labour movement stood in solidarity against Thatcher and Murdoch. And this time it needs to stand in solidarity against Johnson and Murdoch to make sure that we don't repeat that experience all over again.
I want to put John Mann's argument to you today because I think it was notable because it was kind of the Lexit argument that's been made over the last 3 years. We can probably get up this tweet. So in response to Keir Starmer, it's a tweet from Channel 4 News, and it's Keir Starmer was saying last night that this is a worse deal than the one that was put before and it's a recipe for deregulation. John Mann quote tweets this and says, only a majority in Parliament in the future can vote to deregulate, or a majority could vote to strengthen regulation. It's called democracy. So the idea there, and it's got some intuitive appeal, which is to say, why are the Labour Party so terrified of deregulation if we don't have the EU to guarantee those rights? Why do we believe that our labour movement is so weak, and why do we have so little faith in our own capacity to win elections and to increase standards? How would you respond to that?
I don't think we do have very little faith in it. It's basically like, John McDonnell was asked a very similar question on Radio 4 this morning. It was a very, very peculiar question where essentially the presenter said, why don't you trust British people via the conduit of their elected representatives to have British employment rights? Why aren't British employment rights as good as European employment rights? And, John McDonnell made, the very obvious argument that, if you are the Labour Party, why on earth would you even risk a short period, even if you even if you think you can win an election by a landslide? Why would you risk, say 8 months, 6 months, 2 weeks of people not having access to workers' rights? If you are a Labour Party, if you think that there is dignity in employment and that people deserve employment rights, why would you risk even any worker having a day without that protection? So, I don't trust the Conservative Party. The Labour Party don't trust the Conservative Party. The only reason that you would move, everything involved in the level playing field from the withdrawal agreement into the political declaration is because you want to move it away from being legally binding. They're clearly up to something, and if you look at our workers' rights at the moment, they're still quite weak because obviously the unions work very hard to try and get around all sorts of mechanisms that capital moves, but we are constantly fighting against a capitalist system that tries to exploit work, that tries to change the way that automation works, that tries to constantly exploit us, tries to make everything precarious. I can't understand why a labour movement would say, do you know what, it's fine, we'll leave it for 2 years because after those 2 years in which you have no employment rights, we'll win them back for you, and those 2 years your life won't count for anything. It's like austerity, saying it's a short belt tightening exercise, maybe for a government accounting department, but not for somebody's actual life.
I want to go to one more clip and then we're going to move on to whether or not this is actually going to pass. So this final clip we're going to show on this section is John Barron, who's speaking to he's a member of the ERG, and he's speaking to the BBC this morning about why he is willing to vote for the deal.
Will you vote for this one?
Yes, we're seeking assurances. There's a devil in the details still. But the reason I am inclined to vote for this one is very simple. Theresa May's backstop could have had us locked into that arrangement indefinitely. Boris Johnson has torn up that backstop, which means that if the trade talks are not successful after we hopefully agree the deal tomorrow here, if those trade talks are not successful up to December 2020, that's how long they could take, then we could leave on no deal terms. And the reason that's important is by leaving no deal on the table, it makes a good trade deal in those negotiations up to December 2020 more likely to succeed.
So when you say we could leave on no deal terms December of next year, are you basically saying this is effectively no deal Brexit, but just delayed by a year?
Our hope is, I think most of us in Parliament prefer a good deal to no deal, but many of us also accept the reality of life, if you like, when negotiating, that you've got to leave no deal on the table. That helps to make for a better deal when talking about a trade deal up to December 2020. And because that possibility exists after December 2020, I think it will focus minds within the negotiations and we'll get a good trade deal. That is our hope.
So this has been shared a lot today, actually, on Twitter as evidence that, in fact, this deal is a mask or a cover for hard right Brexiteers who want us to have a no deal in a year's time when a trade deal, or if and when a trade deal has not been signed with the Europeans. What do you think about that? How worried should people be about that particular scenario whereby we leave on a no deal at the end of 2020?
Well, so I think there's two parts to it. The first is, as I said in my Guardian piece yesterday, Boris Johnson is either lying to the ERG or he's lying to the Labour Party and to the British people. My guess is that probably he's lying to us and not to his mates in the ERG, who put him into power and on whose support he depends for his office. So he's got to be lying to someone, because if they're all lining up to vote for it because they think they can get no deal, it's a bit implausible for us to then say, oh, no, let's believe Boris Johnson. He's probably just hoodwinked the ERG and not hoodwinked us. I mean, that would be a completely bizarre conclusion to reach. So I think it does leave no deal effectively on the table at the end of 2020. It doesn't leave have no deal in quite the same form as before, because the other aspects of the withdrawal agreement will be in place. So the security cooperation, citizens' rights, and so on. But what it does leave on the table is a no deal in terms of the form of international trade. So you could still just comprehensively wreck the British economy at the end of 2020 because the lunatics still want to exit onto WTO trading terms. So it doesn't leave exactly the same form of no deal on the table, so the citizens' rights, security cooperation and so on, but it does leave the core issue of no deal, where it could, wreak absolute havoc on exports and imports for the UK, absolutely in play, and that's why these people are signing up to support the agreement. So given that's on there, they've attempted to smuggle it in. The problem is that for the Tories now is that John Barron let the cat out the bag. But, it kind of tells you how they've been winning the RG over. And it's Dominic Raab and it's Michael Gove going round telling people, that lunatic fantasy that you have, you can keep it and it's still going on. But what they're up to, why would anyone think that was something that ought to be supported? Whether they are Tory MPs or Labour MPs. So unless you're in that lunatic fringe, I can't see any rational reason for any elected representative to think it's a reasonable thing to vote for a deal that's going to make the country poorer and put the country under perpetual threat that a bunch of extremists will set the whole thing on fire.
Let's move on to whether or not this is going to pass and what's going to happen in Westminster tomorrow. First of all, you're watching Tysky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show, this channel, this organisation is only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears in more people's feeds. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, and keep your comments coming. I will ask some of your questions at the end of the show. Dawn, seasoned political commentator. I want an introduction to what's going to happen in Parliament tomorrow. There's a special parliamentary session the first time they've met on a Saturday, I think, since the Falklands War,
1982.
whereby was in 1982. Yeah, whereby
I was there.
You were there.
No,
you weren't there. Where where MPs are going to vote on whether they accept this deal or not. If it passes, it's obviously a huge victory for Boris Johnson. Potentially, we can leave the European Union on the 31st of October. If it falls, Boris Johnson is going to have to ask for an extension as mandated by the Benn Act, and we won't leave on October the 31st. And then, I mean, we'll discuss what would happen next slightly later. But what do you think is going to happen in Parliament? Will Boris Johnson get his way? Will they assent to this Brexit deal?
So what I find really, really interesting is that I spent all day, as you can tell by the bags under my eyes, touring TV and radio stations and constantly for, media balance being put on with right-wingers. And everybody has been number crunching. Everybody has been talking about what they think is going to happen. And normally when these things happen, I go on as a left-winger and say, I think it will, hopefully ever so slightly not be a disaster for the left. And the right-wingers say, I think the right wing might edge it. Whereas this time I've been on and everybody said the same thing, which is every single person I've been on with, whether they're from The Spectator, The Daily Mail, from any outlet whatsoever, young, old, etc., all sorts of different sources, because, everybody's been just like pounding their phones, asking everybody they know, like looking for smoke signals and all sorts of things. And every single person thinks that it's going to lose by a very, very slim majority, like a very, very small number. We're talking about maybe about 5. I think it could easily lose I think that Boris Johnson could lose by under 10. And obviously most of the focus has been on how many Labour people he needs to bring over. But I mean, around about midday, all of the possible Labour rebels said that they hadn't been contacted by any of the Conservatives whatsoever. Some of them have come out since, they might have been approached since, but the Conservatives weren't really hammering the phones when you assumed they would have been, whereas the DUP said that they were quite confident that actually a lot of Conservatives might at the last minute run into a different lobby and really surprise the whips. So I think that I think it's very, very unlikely that it will pass.
I feel like the commentators I follow last night were saying they think it's going to fall by 2 or 3 votes, and today now they think it's going to pass, and I think that's because more Labour MPs than they expected are now suggesting they might vote for Boris Johnson's deal. So that includes Melanie On, who confirmed this afternoon she'd vote for the deal. She voted against it, but she voted against meaningful vote free, so she voted against Theresa May's deal. Sarah Champion says she's going to vote for Boris Johnson's deal, and Ronnie Campbell said last night he was going to vote for Johnson's deal. May's final meaningful vote, so the third vote on her Brexit deal, lost by a margin of 58, by 344 votes to 286. So Boris Johnson needs 30 switchers. By Alex Wickham's account, 15 people have already confirmed they will be switching, so he needs 15 more people to confirm. Tom, have you been doing calculations? Have you got your own Excel up?
Well, so I think on that, I think it currently stands that 10 Labour MPs are saying that they will vote for it. It's possible a few more come out. I think Dawn makes an important point, which is that the ERG have been remarkably quiet, and it's hard to tell whether some of the real headbangers will suddenly decide at the last minute. Yeah, which is that for some reason all the commentators have acted and told the public that the ERG moves the group when actually they split quite often. Yeah, they do. That's exactly right. They do split quite often, and they compose of quite different people. I think what you saw last time with May's deal going down to such a heavy defeat is that these things have a kind of snowball effect. So once it becomes clear which way it's going to go, if it becomes clear that the deal is going to be defeated, then it will be defeated by a much larger margin, because then people have license to go and vote against it because they can maintain their position as purists. So I think if it becomes apparent tomorrow that the deal won't get through, then I expect that you'll see more of the ERG vote against it in order to sort of stick by their principles. But I do think it is very close, and the truth is we won't know until tomorrow. I think the bigger issue is that it does look like it's not close on the Letwin Amendment. And because the Letwin Amendment looks like it's going to pass actually
So let's just explain the Letwin Amendment. So tomorrow there's going to be a vote on the motion which says we endorse Boris Johnson's deal. Oliver Letwin, who is a Tory he's now been expelled from the Tory party, hasn't he? So he's one of the people who lost, one of the 21 Tories who lost the whip by voting for the Benn Act. He has put forward an amendment with some other big ex-Tory grandees that says, actually, we are just going to note the fact that we have read Boris Johnson's deal, but we will not be passing it until the proper legislation is brought forward. So they're saying we want to see the legal text of the new legislation required to put the Withdrawal Act into force, which can't happen before, well, tomorrow is the 19th, isn't it? So that would mean if the Letwin Amendment passes, Boris Johnson has to ask for an extension from the European Union, and basically Parliament will get slightly more time to mull over what move they want to make.
I think it becomes very significant because it means that if the Letwin Amendment passes, then the whole kind of, it bursts the balloon of tomorrow. It stops being that great dramatic moment where, the deal either stands or fails, and it sort of kicks it back into the sort of bureaucratic quagmire. It is one of those extraordinary things that Parliament has found this real talent for kicking the can down the road.
It's the only thing they can agree on, isn't it?
That's been
the story of the last 2 years.
And I think you're getting quotes, from MPs saying, well, the Letwin Amendment lets us off the hook. And I think what it does mean, potentially, is that, firstly, it means that Johnson will have to get an extension under the Benn Act because if the Letwin Amendment passes, because then there will not have been a meaningful vote. It means that then has to be the legislation brought forward, the Withdrawal Agreement Implementation Bill, that then has to be passed into law, which gives the Labour Party the opportunity to put in lots and lots of amendments to try and mitigate the damage from Johnson's disastrous deal. And then it means that you get the stage set yet again for another showdown in terms of a meaningful vote that presumably would be the final time, but I don't think anyone would confidently predict that would be the final time, just because it's happened on so many different occasions. I think in that period, the other thing that you might see is Nigel Farage waking from his slumber to really savage the deal. And so I think you could find that if there is this period of time, every day that passes from tomorrow that Johnson hasn't won a meaningful vote, I think it makes it harder and harder and harder for him to win a vote if it comes back to the Commons again.
So with respect to the Letwin Amendment, so that might pass tomorrow, and that takes away some of the urgency to this. But there is always going to be, even if that passes, there's going to be legislation that comes back to Parliament in the next couple of weeks, in quite a short period of time.
Passes, that requires that legislation then to come forward.
Yeah. But that means the showdown will just be put off, right? So there's still going to be this question of party management within the Labour Party about disciplining MPs and whether or not they are able to allow to what punishment they will suffer if they vote through a Boris Johnson style Brexit. We have heard from the top of the party yesterday, it was made clear to journalists that Labour MPs would not lose the whip if they vote for Boris Johnson's deal tomorrow. We could presume that might be the case when legislation comes back in a week or so. This has been jumped on by Labour's competitors when it comes to parties seeking the Remain vote. We can get up a tweet from Nicola Sturgeon. So she said this morning, understand Labour MPs will not lose whip if they back PM's deal on Saturday. Oh no, sorry, this is what the BBC journalist said. Understand Labour MPs will not lose whip if they back PM's deal on Saturday. Then Sturgeon says, hope I'm wrong, but I have a real suspicion that Labour would be quite happy to see this deal go through. They will officially oppose, but give nod to rebels to ensure numbers there to pass. It will be the end of them in Scotland if they do end up facilitating Brexit. I suppose two questions. Do you see that the Labour leadership is trying to give the nod to backbenchers to pass this deal so that Brexit can be over and they can move on to other issues? And I suppose, if not, are they leaving an open goal by not being as hard on Labour MPs as they possibly could be, and that this is just a gift to the SNP, to the Lib Dems and other parties that want to put themselves forward as the voice of Remain, and Labour is ultimately the party that betrays Remainers?
I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but I think I really hope I'm wrong. Like Nicola Sturgeon, I hope my cat isn't a dog, but I have a suspicion it might be a dog, even though it looks like a cat and has been a cat all its life. It's this bizarre conspiracy kind of mindset from Nicola Sturgeon that I kind of thought a bit better of. It's a very kind of very, very bizarre FBPE style thing that claims that Corbyn secretly did Brexit and all this sort of nonsense that completely ignores the fact that Labour have been very, very consistent about whipping against all of the kind of, Tory Brexit mayhem that's been going on for the last few months. But there's also this very, very peculiar thing where after Boris Johnson expelled the Tory rebels who voted for the Ben for the Ben Act, rather than reel back from the shock of that and the fact that that was a very, very extreme reaction to rebelling. Normally people rebelled and the whips would wander around and say, well, you can say goodbye to a leisure centre in your constituency, or like the party,
or you're not going to get a promotion, right?
You're
that
not
was the standard one that you won't be able to rise up the party, and now the standard has been set, which is that if you don't kick them out of the party, you secretly actually want them to rebel.
If you want Boris Johnson to open a supermarket in your constituency, then those hopes are gone. But Boris Johnson tossed them summarily out of the party, and everybody was very, very shocked by it. They said it was very brutal, very extreme, and then all of a sudden that's become the new normal. That's a new expectation. And if Corbyn and McDonnell don't essentially threaten to throw these people into the Thames, then they are seen as basically being the midwives of Brexit. It's very, very extreme, and and both Corbyn and McDonnell have said in different ways that they are looking very, very deeply at how to get these people on side, but that for both of them their leadership style is very, very different to just kicking people out of the party. Corbyn pointed out that he wants to have a much more conversational leadership style. He wants to listen to people, make the final say, but try and bring people on board. And John McDonnell on the Radio 4 Today programme said that, I can't remember which one, Ronnie Campbell?
Yeah, Ronnie Campbell.
Yeah, so he was asked about Ronnie Campbell and how Ronnie Campbell was going to vote for Boris's deal. And John McDonnell said, look, I know Ronnie Campbell, and I'm going to say to him, look, you're a good socialist, come on board, and I'll have a very, very long conversation with him about how we can bring him on side. And that seems to be a much more healthy attitude.
It was a bit unhelpful that Ronnie Campbell was the only Labour MP in the Newsnight studio last night in terms of Labour trying to win back Remainers.
What I've been picking up today is that both Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are personally ringing hitting the phones, ringing the wavering Labour
Boris
MPs,
Johnson hasn't,
and saying to them, please don't vote for this deal. These are the reasons why, and I think that's having an effect. But these kind of conspiracy theories are really quite bizarre. Not least because why on earth would it be in Labour's interest to see an anti-working class deal get through, led by Boris Johnson, who had emerged triumphant because he delivered the ERG agenda. Now, having said that, I do think it is a very serious matter for these Labour MPs who are considering doing this. I mean, if you were to imagine it was 1979 and a small group of Labour MPs were able to stop Mrs. Thatcher before she'd gotten started, and instead they said, well, you've got to respect the 1979 general election result, so we're going to vote with Mrs. Thatcher to allow her to unleash this assault on workers' rights. I think from the vantage point of 10 years or 20 years or 30 years on, you'd look back and say, that was one of the most colossal errors in political history. And I think really MPs now have a real choice. Do they really want to unleash that? And what will be the consequences for them personally? Because actually, I don't think this is really a question of the whip anymore, or about booting them out and all of that. But do they really want to spend the rest of their political lifetimes as pariahs in the Labour Party, speaking on panels with Kate Hoey and Paul Embry, or do they want a future in the Labour Party where they are seen to have stood in solidarity with the rest of the Labour movement? So I think given the threat to working people of this deal, I think the Labour Party as a social movement will be very unforgiving of those MPs that choose to vote with the Tories. And the question about the mechanics of do they keep the whip or not, misses the bigger point here about if they break solidarity, what will be the consequences for them.
I think you actually have to go further, and I think that it's not just about their political life. I think you actually have to appeal to their conscience and say, look, if you turn around as a Labour MP and say, look, I'm in a very, very Leave constituency, I'm worried about the next election, I'm worried about whether or not I can actually, get over the finishing line next time, you are going to have to deal with the effects of this vote. You are going to have to deal with the effects of Brexit for the rest of your life, and everybody you know will know how you voted. And unfortunately, you do go into Parliament, and it is a big burden. It is a massive responsibility, and you have to accept the fact that you actually have, the fate of millions of people's lives in your hands, and you have to go up in good conscience and vote for what you think will harm the least people, not what you think will get you elected next time. Think less about what your job means next time, and think more about what it will actually mean for for people in the future. Think about how many people's lives will be harmed, how many people will lose their jobs, how many people will lose their lives. My friend was murdered by the new IRA earlier in this year. These things will keep happening. People will die. People have died from austerity, and I think a lot of Lib Dems and Tories should have that on their conscience, and this should be, on the same level, if not higher than that.
Yeah, and I just don't think during the referendum campaign in 2016, I don't think any Leave voters, well, no, that's not true. There will be some Leave voters, but very few Leave voters thought that they were signing up for more globalisation, more exposure to international competition, fewer manufacturing jobs, fewer rights in the workplace, a trade deal with Donald Trump that puts the NHS on the table in the trade negotiations, the possibility of matching US employment rights, which means your boss can fire you on the spot for no reason, 10 days annual leave, no maternity pay, no sick pay. I don't think that Leave voters were signing up for that vision of the future. And so I find it very hard to hear the message from these Labour MPs saying, well, my constituents wanted Brexit. And I think, yes, they may have voted to leave, but I don't think they voted for anything that looked like this version of Leave, not in the slightest.
In any case, John Landsman is taking a slightly harder approach to MPs who might vote against the whip than Jeremy Corbyn, it seems. So we can get up John Landsman's tweet. So he's on the NEC, and he is saying that Johnson's deal will be a wrecking ball through the lives and well-being of ordinary people across Britain. Labour MPs cannot and must not vote for it. If they do, the NEC will have no choice but to replace them with a new socialist Labour candidate at the next election. His comrade on the NEC, Huda Elmi, friend of the show, says it's pretty basic. Being a Labour MP means opposing the Tories when they try to destroy our country. This reckless sellout deal is even worse than Theresa May's, and any Labour MP that sides with Boris Johnson has no right to stand at the next election. So it could be the case that whilst rebelling against the Labour Free Line whip in this particular vote tomorrow, or whenever the legislation comes back in the future, will not lose you the Labour Party whip, but it will lose you your right to stand at the next general election, because the NEC will take away their consent for you to be a Labour candidate. I just want to go on to one more issue before going to audience questions, which is a people's vote. I've been hearing very mixed messages about what the plan is. So we know that the Labour Party is somewhat undecided about whether they want a second referendum before or after a general election, which means they haven't quite committed to whether or not they would vote for an amendment which ratifies Boris Johnson's deal on the condition that it's put to the public. We're also hearing now that even the People's Vote campaign themselves are not particularly keen to put a People's Vote or a public vote amendment onto Boris Johnson's deal and pass it on the condition that it would go back to the people. What's going on? What are they thinking?
So this morning, Chuka Umunna and John McDonnell, one after the other, said that they would obviously like it to go back to the people at certain points, but this wasn't the time. That essentially Saturday had to be about rejecting Boris Johnson's deal, and so it was quite simple.
And why is this not the time?
Well, my understanding is that the way it's expected to work tomorrow is that there are two motions. The first motion is on Boris Johnson's disastrous deal, and that will be left. The main amendment on that is the Letwin Amendment about waiting for the withdrawal agreement bill to be passed through its legislative stages. The second motion that we expect tomorrow is on no deal, and this is where Johnson is expected to say, well, a motion regarding no deal, and I think it is quite possible that they put down an amendment to the no deal motion, saying that there should be a people's vote, as it's called, or a second referendum, as I think.
And do you think there are other numbers in this parliament to make that happen? I mean, because potentially, you could have a very strange situation if Boris can't pass this deal, which is that you could have no majority in parliament for the deal, no majority for a people's vote, and not a big enough majority for a general election, because obviously you need 2/3. So if there's a 1/3 blocking minority for a general election, we could have a complete parliamentary stalemate.
No, you couldn't, because then you would have to go back to, you'd have to, you could have simple majority where you'd have to form a government, etc.
Well,
you can explain that better than I can.
Yeah,
I'm not bothered.
so I don't think there's a majority for a second referendum at the moment. I think that's in part because it's very obvious that the public are sick and tired of Brexit, and therefore I don't think right now there's a sense that it's got the votes in Parliament. That could change, who knows. In that situation that you describe, you're right, you could get to a stalemate, and the stalemate would be the deal fails, there is not a majority for a second referendum. The blocking minority, the 1/3 blocking minority, is on a dissolution of Parliament, which is where you go to a general election. So you need a 2/3 majority to get to a dissolution. However, the leader of the opposition, but only the leader of the opposition, can table a vote of no confidence in the government. So it would depend. So if that blocking minority contained Jeremy Corbyn, then you could get a complete stalemate. But if Jeremy Corbyn said, "I want to have an election," then he could end up, the way that you could get through it would be for Tory MPs to back a motion of no confidence in their own government, along with whoever was being loyal on the Labour front bench, helping it through. But it's a very messy route through it. Of course, the final option is whether there's a majority to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which would be another route to addressing that. But I agree. I think Labour, is pretty clear. It wants a general election. It want a general election. I think probably next week. Maybe it will want to get. Maybe it will want to get the withdrawal agreement legislation through, or something like that. But Labour's pretty consistent that it wants a general election. It's just about making sure that it's taken no deal off the table, so we don't end up in disaster.
Are you both strongly in favour of general election before second referendum?
Yeah, absolutely.
You are, absolutely.
I just think moving to a second referendum, I think if you move to a second referendum before a general election, then you will just replicate what happened last time. You're asking people to vote again, with nothing really new. Whereas if you ask people to, move to a general election, you're saying, do you have confidence in the government or not? What do you want, a different government? Whereas, I think the Labour position is very clear, and it's very, very smart. And contrary to what media say, it's very, very easy to understand. You can explain it in 2 seconds. It's like...
Well, it does change quite a lot, to be fair.
I haven't noticed it.
I don't think it's that complicated at all.
No, it's like we want a general election, and then we'll negotiate a deal, and we'll put that to the public.
Yeah,
have you got that?
Me?
Oh no, he wasn't listening.
I'm collecting questions. It gets to the point where
maybe you don't
I only half listen
Brexit
to you because I'm looking at audience questions. There's only one person I'm more interested in listening to you, Dawn. Not person, people. It's the Tisky Sour audience. It's the Tisky Sour comment sections. You're the only people who can distract me from your delightful insights.
General election, we win, and then we negotiate Brexit.
Yeah, but obviously there's many people on the front bench who want a second referendum first, which means that sometimes they twist and turn.
That whole second referendum first. The first problem with it is that actually there's no majority for it. The second problem is what would actually be on the referendum. So do you really want a referendum between things that are undesirable, like no deal or this disastrous Johnson deal? But the third problem is, if you don't have the legitimacy for a referendum, then what if Leave voters just said they weren't going to participate?
Yeah.
And they just said, we're not going to show up and we'll respect the 2016 vote. So I think this idea that you can jump straight into a second referendum is not very clever. The final bit is, of course, if you want to win a second referendum, the best way to win a second referendum is to pass an anti-austerity budget to show to the country that you can improve ordinary people's lives, and then say to people, well, here's a referendum on Brexit. Do you want us to carry on with the business of making your life better, improving your public services and so on? Or do you want us to go back into the Brexit hellstorm that we've been in for the last 3 years? So I can't see why it's either feasible or desirable to have a second referendum first.
If you have a second referendum first, all you're doing is saying to every single person who voted leave, and that's a lot of people that I grew up with, that you know, if you have a general election in between two referendums, then people think it's a new government and there's a new deal. We're voting differently. They can understand it. If you turn around and have a second referendum back to back, you're essentially saying to everybody who voted leave, we didn't trust you last time, we don't think you made the right decision, can you have another go? And as Tom said, either they won't participate or they come out in even greater number. And I disagree with Tom in that I think that one of the big issues with a lot of the discussion post-referendum has been that over and over again, Remain voters and Remain campaigners have talked about, the economic risks that come from a no-deal Brexit, saying nobody voted to be poorer. And it's actually, maybe some people did. Maybe some people were actually perfectly happy for things to get worse because their life was pretty crap anyway, and actually they didn't feel that they had a huge amount of control over it. And maybe if they changed the mechanisms and if they felt that they had more of a say in the way that their community was run, if they were if they actually did have some distance from Europe, they were perfectly happy to do it. Gary Young wrote a really good piece for The Guardian, which a lot of people wouldn't really engage with because it doesn't play into the argument they like, but actually, a lot of people that I went to school with, a lot of people that I knew growing up, they voted knowing that they would probably get poorer.
Yeah.
But
this is an argument. My problem here, though, is that this is an argument against.
Anyway,
this is an argument against the second referendum in general. So for me, why having a second referendum on Boris's deal versus Remain would make sense is because if your concern is abstention, then it's actually a very soft Brexit, which is what Labour would offer, versus Remain, which to me risks having the most leavers abstain.
The people I know who voted Leave in 2016 also voted Labour in 2017 because they liked Labour's manifesto. So if you have something different on offer, they will go for it. If you have a Labour government and the Labour government...
That's the core of it.
Yeah. If you have a Labour government and Labour government is saying, I want more money in the NHS, I want your kids to have a better school, that makes a lot more sense than basically saying, could you do it again because we think you got it wrong last time.
Exactly. That's why you need an anti-austerity budget.
Yeah.
Let's have some more questions. Oh, look, we haven't had any of your questions actually yet. So Almus Quatch asks, would passing this deal help or hinder Labour's election prospects?
Passing it would completely scupper it. I would struggle to see.
To do devil's advocate, there is an argument that I've seen that I don't particularly agree with it, which is that if Brexit gets done, then that is when Labour can move on and have a general election on issues that aren't related to Brexit, which, our economic policy is quite popular. Our Brexit policy is a little bit convoluted and it divides our base. So therefore, if it just happens, but the leadership can keep their hands relatively clean, then we can go into a general election just fighting on nationalising rail and on anti-austerity and on having workers-owned companies.
I think that devil's really stupid because that devil assumes that Boris Johnson won't get a big bounce from them being the man who delivered Brexit, and he won't get a poll bounce, and that also that Labour don't care about what happens to voters in the meantime. Even if it passes and we move into a general election in 2022, what happens to people who I use the NHS a lot. I know a lot of people live in poverty. What happens to people who need social housing? Do we just forget about them for 3 years and just hope for the best?
I mean, I also think I'm going to throw it out there and suggest that handing a massive generational victory to the right is probably not good for the left. I don't think in this it's particularly complicated. If it had been different, if this had been Theresa May's deal, which the right hated for various reasons, you might have been able to see the rationale of that argument saying, well, they all hate it, they all think it's bad. It's gone through, Labour could be the beneficiaries. I wasn't completely persuaded by that argument, but it had some degree of persuasiveness. If the ERG really think that this is such a great deal because they get to deregulate and do a trade deal with Donald Trump, how could that possibly be good for the Labour Party? And I think you're seeing that in terms of the way that the Labour leadership are approaching this, doing everything they can to try and stop this deal going through. The Financial Times has just said that they think it's going to pass with a majority. 319 to 315 is their forecast right now, is how they think it's going to go. But I think we just simply, at this point, that to me is basically too close to call.
Tom Walland is channeling the guy in the audience on Question Time. Is there an argument to be made for unification of Ireland to solve Brexit and have a Lexit? I mean, I don't know if the guy in the audience at Question Time wanted a Lexit, but what do you think about that particular argument? Solve the problem with the Irish border by... I mean, I don't think the timescale works, does it?
I think Ireland should be unified, but I also think that, Britain should be socialist. And, I'm perfectly happy for Ireland. Basically, a border poll has come in Ireland, and we know that's going to happen. But we also need to actually win a socialist majority in Britain, and that will need a lot of work at the moment. I don't think... as I've heard some people, I think it's pretty clear, I think everybody here would agree that Irish unification is coming, and that's fine, it's going to happen.
But it's happening on their own timescale,
yeah,
right?
And
Not to solve our Brexit problem.
But also, Irish unification doesn't really change much about British politics per se. So the big issue that Labour really need to address is probably kind of Wales and Scotland. So stopping the rise of Plaid Cymru in the SNP, trying to make sure that there's a socialist majority in Wales and Scotland, and making sure that we keep a lot of those seats. So there's a lot of work to be done there. I don't see how Irish unification would kind of solve anything, but equally, I want Labour to. I think if Scotland went independent, it would be a big issue. If Scotland went independent, essentially, you have England and Wales tied together, and if Ireland hopefully becomes unified, if Scotland goes independent, you have England and Wales tied together, and then you essentially have a Tory majority for forever.
I mean, if you
what do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, that's
if we're quite defeatist. We can win England.
To take your viewer's question, though, I still don't understand how sorting out the question of Northern Ireland would enable a Lexit to be delivered by a hard right Tory government.
No.
This has always been the problem that I have with this idea of Lexit, is that I don't understand in which particular way anyone ever thought that a right-wing government was going to deliver a left-wing Brexit. It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Say if this deal passes and then Labour win the next general election, can the features of this deal be refashioned by a Labour government who's negotiating the future trading relationships to create a Lexit?
This is my issue with Lexit over and over again. As Tom said, Brexit is a hard right project. Just trying to tack onto it as part of the left and saying it's fine, we'll win in 2022. What about everybody else in the meantime?
No, but we can win. There might be a general election in a month.
But
in 6 weeks.
But if Boris Johnson wins it, if Boris Johnson wins this deal, there is no need for a general election. If Boris Johnson wins this deal, even if he calls one, he'll probably win it. So I mean, again, Brexit is a hard right project, and I just don't understand any leftists who try to tack onto it and thinks that they can somehow kind of steer it out of the wall once you've crashed it in there. Once you've opened this can of worms, you have Farage, you have the far right, you have everybody just baying for blood, and you think that you can kind of push that back in. That's absolute nonsense.
Everything she said.
Okay, fine. I think you both think there couldn't be a referendum on this deal. So Mark Stotts asked, could there be a referendum on this deal?
There isn't the numbers. There aren't the numbers, rather.
I mean, there could be, but
at what point did the People's Vote campaign give up? When Brexit's happened, I suppose. If this passes on Saturday, then they give up.
So People's Vote campaign give up when Corbynism gives up, because they don't actually care about.
It's our policy
Brexit.
Now. It's our policy, though.
I mean, every time I've met People's Vote campaigners, they have cared more about stopping Brexit, stopping Corbyn, than they have cared about stopping Brexit. They are more than happy. I regularly speak to them, and they generally think they can win Tories round, but they think it's unconscionable they would that they would ever speak to Labour. They're utterly convinced, these weird kind of brainworm Putin people who are convinced that everything is run from the Kremlin, like all this weird conspiracy.
I think if we actually do leave, I think there will be two things that will happen to the People's Vote campaign. Part of it, I think, will turn into a demand for a referendum to return, and that will appeal to probably 10 or 15% of the population who are kind of really into FBPE. They almost certainly, in fact, they definitely already vote Lib Dem. They're not going to be voting for anyone else. I think anytime soon, and that's what part of the People's Vote campaign I think will become. Partly because you've just got the kind of micro level interests of this is now people now feel that they have a job of being an anti-Brexit campaigner, and they'll want a job if we leave the European Union, and so they'll immediately say, well, I'm going to dedicate my life to the cause of getting Britain back into the EU, partly because it provides continuity of employment. I think the second thing that will happen to the People's Vote campaign is that part of it will turn into effectively the leadership campaign for a candidate on the sort of moderate right wing part of the Labour Party, to try and take back control of Labour would be my guess. I mean, I don't know that for sure. But
Hashtag Jess Phillips.
I've already spoken to 3 prominent kind of FEP type People's Vote campaigners who have said that once they stop full-time campaigning for this sort of thing, they're going to go for Lib Dem leadership. So,
Interesting. Yeah. I think let's end it there. We need some rest before tomorrow, watching and commenting on the special parliamentary session. Potentially, if it's dramatic enough, we might have an emergency Tisky Sour that evening. But if there's a kind of
I love the idea of an emergency Tisky Sour.
Well, if there's an anti-climax and the Letwin Amendment passes and it's just like they've kicked it into the long grass, we probably don't need a show to tell you that they've kicked it into the long grass. We'll just tweet they've kicked it into the long grass. Tune in to Tisky Sour next week. But if something incredibly dramatic happens and either the deal passes or I think if it gets voted down, that's also quite dramatic, right?
Yeah,
it's only the Letwin Amendment that makes it not dramatic. So actually, unless the Letwin Amendment passes, we will have a Tisky Sour tomorrow evening. But you should also support the Letwin Amendment passing. So lobby your MP, so I don't have to do a Tisky Sour tomorrow. Thank you, Dawn Foster. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Tom Kibasi. Wonderful to have you in.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Michael.
You have been watching Tisky Sour. You've been watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Like this video, tweet this video, share it on Facebook. Well, don't keep your comments coming because we're going offline, but you can keep commenting under the video. See you when I see ya.